So we all know Yu-Gi-Oh is a really complicated game. With a card pool of over 10,000 unique cards, inevitably there will be some conflictions with the actual rulings for this game. But on top of this is the fact that Konami actually does not release official rulings for their cards in the TCG, which often leaves newer cards to be left up to human interpretation for how they function, especially if there's discrepancy in the actual text. So naturally, across the history of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, there's been more than one case of a ruling that has screwed over a player or pissed off the community. Today I thought it'd be fun to take a look down Yu-Gi-Oh memory lane and check out the times that the Yu-Gi-Oh rulings and policies made zero sense. Let's rewind 12 years back in 2012 when INZEKTORs were a thing. The infamous ruling clash with INZEKTOR Hopper. Now, for those of you guys that don't remember, INZEKTORs were an insect archetype that relied on equipping monsters to each other and then triggering their effects when the equipped monster was sent from the field to the graveyard. INZEKTOR Hopper does exactly that. This card says when it's equipped to a monster, you can send this equipped card to the graveyard, then the equipped monster can attack directly this turn. Now, INZEKTOR Hopper was released as a TCG exclusive during a time when a lot of high-impact TCG exclusive monsters were released in the card game, and none of these monsters actually had any official rulings because Konami did not apply any official rulings to the TCG, unlike Konami Japan, which actually provided rulings to the OCG. So INZEKTOR Hopper was left up to human interpretation, and the judges actually ruled for the first couple of YCSs in the 2012 season that INZEKTOR Hopper could be activated as early as turn 1. This allowed the deck to basically have much more consistency because previously they would rely on their sole ammunition monster, INZEKTOR Hornet, which actually forced you to send itself to destroy one of your own cards on the field in order to trigger the effects of INZEKTOR Dragonfly and Centipede. But now the deck could play 3 copies of INZEKTOR Hopper, which was an additional 3 copies of consistency in addition to Hornet, and allowed you to trigger INZEKTOR Dragonfly and Centipede on turn 1 by sending this card from the field to the graveyard to allow them to attack directly. Now the only problem is in Yu-Gi-Oh, there's no battle phase on turn 1, and because this card literally has an effect that is related to attacking, a battle phase would be required in order to resolve an effect like this. Like, think about it, guys. You cannot activate Dark Hole when there are no monsters on the field. Similarly, you cannot activate Mystical Space Typhoon when there's no target on the field. But with 3 copies of Hopper added to the mix, they could trigger the effects of INZEKTOR Dragonfly and Centipede on turn 1 much more consistently and without having to nuke their own cards along the process. Now, this ruling was eventually amended, and they did rule that future cards which involved the battle phase could not activate on turn 1. So cards like Mermail Abyss Megalo, which required you to tribute a water monster so it could attack twice, could no longer be activated on turn 1. But of course, the INZEKTOR players rejoiced all around the world because they were able to take advantage of INZEKTOR Hopper, a card that was previously borderline unplayable, suddenly becoming extremely playable and stable to the deck because you could trigger the effects of your monsters going first. But needless to say, this was not a huge high-impact thing in the metagame because INZEKTORs were already power crept by the other TCG exclusives that allowed us to play decks like Dino Rabbit, as well as Wind Up Shark and Wind-Ups, which could hand loop you, and so the ruling was only controversial for a brief period of time. Speaking of monster effects with controversial rulings, allow me to introduce you to EVILSWARM CASTOR and CONSTELLAR POLLUX. These were monsters which shared continuous effects, which said during the turn this card was normal summon, you can normal summon one EVILSWARM or CONSTELLAR monster in addition to your normal summon or set. Now, this was always treated as a continuous effect in the OCG as well as in Yu-Gi-Oh video games that were on the Nintendo DS, which means that the effect instantly kicks in and applies when you normal summon the card successfully, so could not be interacted with off of a card like Effect Veiler or Fiendish Chain to negate the effect. At YCS MEADOWLANDS in 2011, the judges actually ruled during the player meeting on Saturday that EVILSWARM CASTOR and CONSTELLAR POLLUX were triggered effects upon their successful normal summon, meaning that they activated and it would be able to be responded to with a card like Effect Veiler or Fiendish Chain, therefore negating the effect and guaranteeing that you would not be able to summon another CONSTELLAR or EVILSWARM monster from your hand. I remember this event being seated in the players meeting, and there was literally a collective groan across the entire convention hall as the EVILSWARM players just all realized that their deck was literally unplayable for that event. Now, this ruling, of course, led to some public outcry in the online Yu-Gi-Oh community because this was a ruling that was somehow made up in their eyes on the spur of the moment at this event. People were like, how could the judges possibly interpret this wrong? Especially during a time where problem-solving card text was already a thing, so cards that activated had a colon in the effect while these monsters did not. Not to mention there were already effect precedents that were worded the exact same, which were treated as continuous effects. And the wording was exactly identical to Dverg of the Nordic Alfar, which says during the turn this card is normal summon, you can normal summon one Nordic monster in addition to your normal summon / set. You can only gain this effect once per turn. This was already treated as a continuous effect, alongside Dr. Dragon, which says when this card is normal summon, for the rest of the turn, your opponent cannot activate any counter trap cards. Both of these were already treated as continuous effects, but suddenly EVILSWARM, CASTOR, and POLLUX were treated on the contrary, so players were obviously very upset with this.
For those of you that are new, I am a YCS level judge, and today I'm here to talk to you about the EVILSWARM CASTOR ruling and how people responded to that. Now, at YCS MEADOWLANDS, it was ruled by the head judge that EVILSWARM CASTOR was a continuous effect. In come all the rage, all the hate, you know. I personally was cussed out by at least 5 players about this ruling. I mean, I didn't even make the ruling. I didn't come up with this. All yelling about the incompetent judges. First off, most of the people saying these things, you've never judged a YCS. You have no idea what it's like to judge a YCS. Most of you don't even know what it's like to judge, period. And especially those of you that were not there for the event, like people that didn't even attend Meadowlands are screaming and crying about how the head judge, like, off with his head. People were calling for him to never ever judge again. Just because you do not agree with the ruling does not mean that we get to pitch hissy fits about it. Like, honestly, that's what a lot of players did. Especially, I had a few people message me and were like, "Oh, you're just effing moron. You don't know how to judge." And again, you don't know what it's like to judge.
In fact, the entire community emailed the official Konami Yu-Gi-Oh! Rules email, and across the next 3 days after YCS Meadowlands, the most asked question was, how do EVILSWARM, CASTOR, and CONSTELLAR POLLUX work? They literally asked this question 2,000% more than any other ruling question. And Konami actually released a public statement clarifying how EVILSWARM, CASTOR, and POLLUX work, because they were kind of backed into a corner where the entire community was in outrage, and they finally said, hey guys, we kind of messed up in this event. This is how the cards work. Yes, they are in fact continuous effects that do not trigger. They even asked the community what would be the best way to actually word these cards moving forward so there's no discrepancy. They were literally that vulnerable at that moment in time. Now, yeah, you gotta feel a little bit bad for the Constellar and EVILSWARM players that were actually at YCS Meadowlands and learned that ruling when they were literally starting to play with the decks on that morning. But, I mean, you know, it does happen. At the end of the day, when Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't have any official rulings, this is what might happen when you leave it up to human interpretation, because everyone can kind of read text differently and interpret it differently. The magical meltdown incident at YCS Utrecht in 2020 is another example of when the judges overread a card. Now, everyone knows that magical meltdown has a continuous effect that reads the activation of your cards and effects that include an effect to fusion summon a fusion monster cannot be negated. Also, your opponent's cards and effects cannot activate when a monster is fusion summoned this way. Now, the judges at YCS Utrecht actually took this a step further and actually interpreted this to be for both players. So in the mirror match, if your opponent controlled the magical meltdown and you activated Shadal Fusion, you would actually not be able to activate the Shadal monster effects in your graveyard as well as the Shadal Fusion monster on the field, because they interpreted only the last line saying that your opponent's cards and effects cannot activate when a monster is fusion summoned, including your opponent's fusion summon. This is obviously pretty crazy. If you're playing Invoked and you queued up against an Invoked mirror match, the magical meltdown was just a god spell at that point that stopped everything. It was a lingering floodgate in addition to the rest of its effects. This is obviously only event specific, and of course none of the other events before or after ruled it that way, and for good reason too, because magical meltdown would have been way too busted and would have seen the ban list ASAP. It would literally give you an excuse to normal summon Alistair the Invoker in 2024. But luckily, that's not the case. Now, if you play Edison format, then you're probably somewhat familiar with this deck, the X-SABERs. Now, it just turns out there was an especially controversial ruling with the X-SABERs in the set The Shining Darkness, which is a set that just came out after the tail end of Edison. Now, the original text for XX-SABER DARKSOUL read, if this card you control is sent to the graveyard, during the end phase, you can add one X-SABER monster from your deck to your hand. Now, what seems like a simple line of text to activate and resolve actually caused a huge controversy in the community because this was the first card of its kind and we had never seen an effect like this prior to Yu-Gi-Oh! And because there were no official rulings given out by Konami, the judges in 2010 had to make a decision on this card and how it functioned. And upon some conversation with R&D, they actually decided that XX-SABER DARKSOUL triggers immediately when it's sent to the graveyard, which meant that off of one single copy of XX-SABER DARKSOUL, you could actually search multiple X-SABER cards in the end phase by repeatedly sending that same copy of DARKSOUL to the graveyard over and over and over again.
As most of you know, I'm a head judge at my locals. I am the head judge, I should say. And I've been the head judge at my locals for about 2.5 years now. And when I heard this ruling from the very beginning, I was like, this makes no damn sense whatsoever.
Yes, you could literally summon it out with Rescue Cat, synchro off, and then trigger the effect in the graveyard, bring it back with a card like XX-SABER Faltro, synchro off again, trigger the effect again in the graveyard, bring it back with Gotham's Emergency Call, trigger it again. Then in the end phase, you can search for 3 copies of X-SABER monsters, despite the fact that you looped one single copy of XX-SABER DARKSOUL, triggering it 3 times as it was sent to the graveyard and revived over and over again. No, it did not have to stay there in the graveyard to activate or resolve the effect. And the ruling took nearly 2 years to actually resolve after it was finally released in Japan, and Konami Japan stepped in and said, hey guys, this card can only trigger once during the turn that it's sent to the graveyard, and it has to trigger in the end phase. Now, this meant that you could not loop the same copy of X-SABER DARKSOUL, but also that same copy of DARKSOUL had to remain in the graveyard, meaning if your opponent used something like a DD Crow, you would not be able to activate it because it had to trigger in the graveyard during the end phase, a lot like Skarm, the Malabranch of the Burning Abyss. But of course, this allowed X-SABERs to wreak havoc across multiple formats before it was finally power crept by the likes of Dino Rabbit, INZEKTOR, and Windups, and even still, it kind of like put up a fight. You know, there was a random X-SABER deck that somehow went 7-1 without a side deck on day 1 at YCS Miami in 2013, and this was after the ruling was reversed, which kind of speaks to how powerful and explosive the deck was. You know, you play high-impact cards like Heavy Storm, Cold Wave, Rescue Cat, and of course, using Gotams to loop your opponent's hand along the way, Faltro to summon back your monsters over and over. Even the one copy of DARKSOUL didn't really matter. But obviously with this ruling, the whole community was like, what the heck is this? Because there was never a card that could generate insane amounts of advantage. Like, this was literally on the power level of something like Spellbook of Judgment at the time, because you could theoretically search your deck for like 5 or 6 copies of X-SABERs off of one lone XX-SABER DARKSOUL if you had the right setup to bring it back over and over and synchro or tribute it off for XX-SABER Gotams to rip a card out of your opponent's hand. Now, luckily we did not have this card for Edison format either, or else X-SABERs would have been absolutely disgusting in that format. Now, in addition to being card rulings that made absolutely no sense, there were actually some policy changes that invoked equal amount of uproar in the Yu-Gi-Oh community collectively. Now, again, if you guys play Time Wizard formats like Go Control or Edison, you're probably familiar with turn player ignition priority. Now, turn player ignition priority is different than turn player priority, okay? How it works is if you're the turn player and you summoned a monster without starting a chain, let's say you normal summon or you synchro summon something out of your extra deck, you as the turn player can actually activate an ignition effect before your opponent can activate any other effects, including any fast or quick effects. So yes, this is the reason why in Edison, if you normal summon Zombie Massacre or Lumina, you can actually activate these ignition effects before your opponent has a chance to respond with something like Torrential Tribute. Now, this also means that you could activate card effects in the graveyard like Glow Up Bulb or Mizuki if you normal summon a monster before your opponent can use any other card effects. Now, back in the day, this also meant if you normal summoned a monster that had an ignition effect to banish or send itself to the graveyard as a cost, for example, Rescue Rabbit or Lone Fire Blossom, the opponent would not be able to respond with a card like Effect Veiler because there would be nothing to target as the monster had already banished itself or sent itself to the graveyard for a cost. Now, we all know this is not the case in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! If I normal summon Lone Fire Blossom or Rescue Rabbit, my opponent will be able to activate Effect Veiler targeting the rabbit and then preventing me from actually resolving its effect. But back in the day, ignition priority was how you played, and it was very, very broken for the turn player, having that additional benefit to dodge things that targeted like Effect Veiler. And back then, the changes were published in some Shonen Jump magazines, so you would literally have to buy that edition of the magazine to see what the heck was happening. And obviously, this caused considerable stir in the TCG community community, anticipating that it would happen to the TCG eventually as well, because generally changes back in the day applied for the TCG after they came to the OCG first. And of course, the player base was correct, because on April 25th, 2012, a year later, this same change came to the TCG, and turn player ignition priority was no longer in the game, which made Effect Veiler basically shoot up in price overnight, because now Rescue Rabbit could be interacted with. Now, at the time, a lot of players were not happy with this change. They were already used to playing Yu-Gi-Oh! For over 10 years since their game's release. Competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! You were playing with turn player ignition priority, which meant that you could do a lot of things as a turn player, and they was very favorable to you when you were playing. So a lot of players were not happy with this change, and they were complaining. A lot of players were protesting. They said that they wanted to boycott Yu-Gi-Oh!, which kind of rings a bell in modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! I guess history repeats itself. But long story short, this was a huge change. Players had to adapt. Effect Veiler became insanely good overnight. Cards that attributed themselves as a cost were no longer nearly as good as they used to be. The opponent could now activate Torrential Tribute if you normal summon Lone Fire Blossom. Before, you were able to try and tribute it for a copy of Dandelion. A lot of things changed with the game after they removed this. Now, this is not to be confused with turn player priority. Of course, we still have turn player priority right now. So if I normal summon a Rescue Rabbit, as a turn player, I would be able to activate a fast effect. For example, something like a Mystical Space Typhoon or Super Polymerization, you would be able to activate as a turn player before your opponent is able to activate their own fast effects. But the difference being there's now a closed game state when you do make that summon, so you cannot activate any ignition effects in your field or your graveyard before your opponent has a chance to respond with their own effect. This is an interesting time for Yu-Gi-Oh! To say the least. And of course, last but not least, the most infamous policy change to do with the end of round procedures, aka the time rules. Now, back in the day, how it worked was each round had 40 minutes for you to finish your match of Yu-Gi-Oh! But if players were still playing, then you would each have 3 turns before you would calculate life points. So if time was called on my turn would be turn 0, then my opponent gets turn 1, I get turn 2, my opponent gets turn 3, 4, and then 5, so on and so forth. At the end of turn 5, we calculate each other's life points. Whoever has higher life points is a winner of that duel. However, on June 2nd, 2018, everything changed with this end of match procedure because time rules were officially discarded in favor of checking life points at the end of the current phase, which was a huge difference. Players basically had to adapt completely differently, and life points are calculated at the end of the phase, so you had to speed through and hopefully reach the battle phase if you wanted to deal some damage. But it also meant that the side decking theory changed forever because players were now side decking burn cards or life point gain cards like Volcanic Scatter Shot, Fiendsmith Lacrima in order to burn their opponent for life points in time, and then they would proceed to end the phase and win because their life points were higher. Cards like Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood are also especially popular in modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! Because of this particular time rule. Now, naturally, the entire community was in uproar. They hated this time rule because it made no sense. It kind of made a lot of disputes at the beginning as well, because the player might have been trying to enter the battle phase while the opponent had no cards, but the opponent just held up the game trying to think or check a graveyard, so they could not deal the damage they needed. And at the first YCS with this time rule implemented, there were a ton of disputes and a ton of draws because of it. After round 2, there were nearly 200 players with draws because players were not used to how these new time rules work. From a player perspective, it was an awful change, but from a logistical perspective for the judges and the tournament organizers, this was a fantastic change because previously the 5 turns meant that the tournaments lasted way longer. For example, YCS Long Beach, actually day 1 ended at 2 or 3 a.m. and then players were forced to come back on day 2 at 9 a.m. to play the rest of the tournament, meaning they would only get 4 or 5 hours of sleep. But now with the new time rules, YCSs and regionals sometimes ended before dinner time, so you could literally eat something, which was amazing and unprecedented. Tournaments ended way faster. It was cheaper for Konami to rent out the venue space because they would not go into overtime anymore. And overall, it was a better experience, and it seems that they're keeping it for that reason. But this is ironic because in the OCG, they still play out 3 turns each into time, which is different than the TCG. Of course, they have smaller tournaments, so that might explain why. But in other games like Pokemon and Magic the Gathering, they also have the end of time procedure where you each get a couple of turns. However, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a different beast because the combos take a lot longer, there's no mana system, and generally games can go on forever if there's a grind game. So it kind of makes sense from a logistical standpoint. But initially when this time rule was made, a lot of players were complaining, and still a lot of players are complaining to this day, hoping for some kind of middle ground between the old time rules and the new time rules. If there's some way they could maybe make it so the turn player plays until the end of the turn or something along the lines. So time cards are not nearly as promoted as they are in the current metagame. Interesting interesting to note that this new time rule is something that the OCG players have not yet adjusted to and was a source for a lot of their complaints during the World Championship 2023 and the World Championship 2024, which apparently was due to the fact that it was the first World Championship which implemented the new TCG time rule. At the World Championship in 2023, no OCG players actually made top 8 for the first time in Yu-Gi-Oh history. They didn't know how to play, they didn't know how to scoop early. They were used to taking their time, and if you guys don't know, in OCG, they like to take their time thinking about moves and take forever, what would be constituted as slow play in a normal TCG event. So naturally, none of the OCG players sided any time cards like Volcanic Scattershot or Spooky Dogwood, and the TCG players just dominated because they knew how to play in time. Same thing happened in the World Championship 2024. First round feature match, we saw that the OCG player got burned in time by Lacrima, and they didn't know that they had to scoop early. And again, only 2 OCG players made top 8 as opposed to having a plethora, a majority count of OCG players. And for the first time ever at both World Championships, actually North America dominated and won both championships with the new time rules. So just something to think about. But yeah, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on these policy and rulings that made basically no sense or caused some uproar in the community. Guys, what do you think? Are there any policy changes or any rulings that were event specific, which was bizarre and made no sense? Let us know in the comments below. Other than that, smash that subscribe button and the like button. Thanks a lot for tuning in. See you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.